Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out with the most pressing news, and that is that the Russian forces have started the fighting within the city of Novomykhailivka. According to the latest reports, the Russian forces throughout the last 24 hours managed to gain a foothold and capture the fortified area here to the eastern outskirts of the city, although not much is seen here with the satellite imagery. From footage we've seen from the area, the Ukrainian forces have significantly increased the sizes and strength of the fortifications east of the city, and with these advances they have now managed to gain control over these fortifications. And since then, it was later reported today, over the past 4 hours, that the Russian forces have started entering the city and the fighting is now taking place within it. We get multiple pieces of footage from the city as fighting continues in the area. We start out with this geolocated footage, which shows a Russian FPV drone hitting a Ukrainian vehicle, infantry fighting vehicle here in the northwestern parts of the city as it moves into position to fight the Russian forces. We then move on to this video by Deep State Map, which shows another geolocated piece of footage, which shows Russian forces throughout the Novomykhailivka direction as they fight over the trenches, and heavy smoke from all of the shelling happening in the area and FPV drones flying around. All of this shows two things. The first thing is that there is very heavy fighting and a lot of equipment and supplies have been allocated to this area as the Ukrainian forces want to hold on to the city. We see that the fighting is happening in the sense of Russian forces storming the city from multiple directions with armored vehicles and infantry assault groups, while the Ukrainian forces have predetermined positions throughout the city and are trying to hold on to their fortifications, which end up being taken by the Russian storm units. So we see all of this fighting that has taken place, and the territory captured by the Russian forces were all heavily defended and heavily entrenched. So with this, we see that the Russian forces, with the now entry into the city, allows them to gain a foothold into it. And if the advances continue and they manage to hold on to and consolidate a foothold, based on how other fights have taken place throughout the other parts of the front line, we see that as soon as the Russian forces get a foothold, they usually hold on to it and manage to advance through it. Similar as the case with southeast of Avdiivka, they've managed to gain a foothold in the residential area. Although we haven't really seen any advances in 5 days, we know that they have been able to hold on to it despite Ukrainian counterattacks, like this one where we have this geolocated footage, which shows that the Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack in the direction of the northwestern outskirts of the industrial zone, but the Russian FPV drones hit their positions as they tried to advance. So while the heavy fighting continues all throughout the southern parts, we also see that the Russian forces managed to advance slightly here to the southwest of Severne. With this, they have managed to capture this forest line here, which is very wide, and it is one of the most important ones, as this forest line here is the final line of defense of the Ukrainian forces prior to the villages of Tonenke and Severne. With the Russian control over it all the way from the east of Severne to the west, we see that the Russian forces will likely launch a multiple part assault similar to Novomykhailivka, where they attack from multiple directions to spread out the Ukrainian defenders in the area and try to find a weak point to take advantage of by launching attacks on those positions. We see that the strongest flank of the Ukrainian forces in the direction of Severne is here to the south and to the east, and the strongest for Tonenke is to the south and to the west. Therefore, we see that the weakness of Severne is here to the west, yet the weakness of Tonenke is to the east, which is covered by this forest patch here. So Tonenke is essentially strong enough by itself to hold back any of the Russian forces' attempts to attack the village. The weakness of Tonenke is this gap right here between the eastern and western defenses. As such, the Russian forces may look to capture Severne before moving on to Tonenke to take advantage of the area where they are weakest. However, this is a challenge in and of itself, as the weakest point of Severne is covered by Tonenke. So they may fake an assault towards Tonenke to then launch attacks towards Severne and gain an advantage there by attacking its weak point. However, we are seeing no signs of a Russian armored assault here to the south of Severne, as the Ukrainian forces have a lot of artillery allocated to this area, which comes at the expense of Bakhmut, which the Russian forces have now managed to gain full control over the Dacha area. And with this, they actually have 100% control over Bakhmut here on the 20th of December, which is exactly 7 months after they captured the city itself. So with this, we see that the tale of Bakhmut has now formally ended with that. Meanwhile, the official Ukrainian position is that the situation in Soledar has developed not necessarily to Ukraine's advantage. We then move on to the Robotine direction, where the Russian forces have launched attacks across the anti-tank ditch that runs all throughout the south of Novomykhailivka, through the area here to the south of Robotine and in the direction of Verbove. So it looks like the Russian forces with this plans on something similar to cutting off the Ukrainian forces across the anti-tank ditch by covering and taking control over the area in between the anti-tank ditch and the Ukrainian positions. So the Ukrainian forces still have footholds across in the trenches here to the west of Verbove. As such, they have a lot of positions across the anti-tank ditch, and with these recent advances in this month, the Russian forces may look to cut off those positions by cutting off the anti-tank ditch from the Ukrainian positions within them, cutting them off from their supply lines and forcing them in a position that is very difficult, as Russian forces could then launch attacks to them without the Ukrainian forces receiving any help and being stuck behind anti-tank ditches, which makes it very difficult for them to hold their positions. Every so often, the Ukrainian forces launched counterattacks in the direction of Avdiivka. We saw the tank that was roaming freely here in the Dacha area to the east of the Avdiivsky coke plant. We saw a recent advance by the Ukrainian forces trying to recapture parts of the industrial zone and cutting off the supplies of the Russian forces who got the foothold in the residential area. And now we also see a Ukrainian tank attempt a counterattack here in the north of Stepove as it tried to recapture some of the recently captured positions of the Russian forces before they consolidated. However, the Russian forces managed to destroy this tank prior to it gaining any success, as is appearing in this geolocated footage here. We then move on to the Bogdanivka area here in the northern flank of Bakhmut, where we just received information that the Russian forces launched attacks towards Bohdanivka and have managed to enter it from the north. Whether the north means here to the northeast or to the northwest, we don't know yet, as we wait for further confirmation by Syriac maps. However, this indicates that the Russian forces, with the recent capture over the forest patches here to the east of Bogdanivka, has gained an advantage which allows them to then push in this direction. Likely it is from the northeastern direction, as it is with the forest lines under Russian control. We see that they still lack this part right here, while in the northern direction they have gained control over most of it, and with the capture over the dense forest patches here to the east, it would be much easier for them to then move on in this direction compared to the northwestern parts, which is much less under Russian control. Either case, it seems that if this information is accurate, the Russian forces is continuing to gain the upper hand in the northern flank of Bakhmut. One of the main reasons for the recent Russian success throughout the front line, but mainly in the Bakhmut direction, is the so-called lack of shells, or a shell famine. According to some leaked information, a shell famine in the Ukrainian armed forces has become a reality. The problem became so acute that Zelensky traveled to the west to beg, among other things, for the ammunition. The reason for this state of affairs is the precise attacks of the Russian armed forces on military warehouses in the depths of the front and in the rear. This is also contributed by the 6 months long offensive operations the Ukrainians launched, after which we saw a now 3 months limbo in the United States Congress and the EU Parliament of no additional aid to Ukraine, no additional significant aid to Ukraine being announced, with the $60 billion package and the €50 billion package both being delayed to the new year. So with all of this, we see that there's continuous issues for the Ukrainian supplies. And Julian Rybke, who is a German journalist who has contacts within the Ukrainian army, asked his contacts about it, of which they say nothing works anymore. He asked his contacts in the Ukrainian armed forces about the lack of 155 and 152mm artillery shells. They say it is not just that they do lack them and they have a severe lack of these artillery shells, but nothing works anymore. The Western self-propelled howitzers are not created for a real long war, but instead only for short missions. They've also previously complained about the French Caesar cannons, saying they're not well made for the winter seasons. This is likely because the most operations they see on the French army is the Sahel region, where the French army had a large presence, after which they were kicked out by Wagner forces after the governments of these countries opted for Wagner over the French army. The point being that French weaponry doesn't seem to be made for winter seasons in Ukraine, but instead for the deserts in Africa. All of these issues for Ukraine add up if no significant help comes from the West soon, and the West doesn't learn from the mistakes they've made so far with both the equipment they're being sent and the amount of it, and all of these other things like how well it works in these war conditions. Then the conditions for the Ukrainian army and their ability to fight this war will continue to decrease and become more complicated and difficult. And while all of these issues with equipment and artillery shells, ammunition all appear at the same time, Zelensky also had a press conference yesterday. In this press conference, he mentions and that Zelensky proposed mobilizing another 500,000 people, but Zelensky replied that he needed more arguments to approve this. Specifics are needed. According to the reports, the additional 500,000 men will be done to fill in the gaps after the many soldiers of the Ukrainian army has lost, and to have something to stand against if Russia decides to launch a major attack. This means that the current situation of the Ukrainian armed forces is that they do not nearly have enough troops to deal with the season of 2024, when the Russian army is going to increase in size and capabilities, and the Ukrainian forces are lacking in support. The Ukrainian forces looking for another 500,000 troops means that they have taken a lot of casualties and that the situation is looking pretty dire for them right now. And all of these things add up to a terrible situation for Ukraine, and a lot needs to be done if they need to continue this fight. Otherwise, as multiple EU officials have already said, including the Czech president, they see that it is increasingly likely that the Russians will come out on top in this war. Signs of this is the Ukrainian failure when it comes to its counteroffensive here in Zaporizhia direction, and the continuous loss of land in the direction of Avdiivka. These things add up and the Ukrainian morale goes down. However, the Ukrainian will to fight is still up there, as Ukrainian soldiers interviewed still come up with the fact that, and I quote, "Even if we run out of ammunition, we'll just pick up shovels and beat them back." It seems that some Ukrainian soldiers have been inspired by Wagner. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.